Good evening. Welcome back once again to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries here in very sunny and very hot Latonia. Before we started recording, I had to run down to our local Dairy Queen and get a cold drink because I was burning up with the temperature. I've been outside a bit today, like most of us when we've got a day off where we work outside, and I think I overdid it. Anyway, it's the day after Labor Day for us. For you, you're not going to see this for another 2 or 3 weeks, but never mind, I'm glad you're with me. It's the day after Memorial Day, I've just been reminded. What did I say? Labor Day. I said Labor Day, didn't I? I'm wishing. You know. The day after Memorial Day. I'm sorry, folks. Don't immediately rush and adjust your calendars, please. We don't record that far ahead. Okay. It's been an interesting week for us. We've had a lot of things happening in the church and a lot of things happening in our private lives too. But it's always nice to settle down quietly after the rush of the everyday and the peace and quiet of the studio. And I'm joking with my tongue firmly in my mouth because anything less peaceful and quietful behind those windows there you wouldn't believe. But here we are, another Bible Speaks. And we're still talking about Nazareth. You'll remember last week we finished up with Bethel and then, 2 weeks ago, and then did the first program on Nazareth. And one of the things I said in the first program was it's amazing that as important as Nazareth is to our Christian belief, you know, it's where Jesus was born, we think, not born, where Jesus was raised and lived and where he did his first preaching and that sort of thing. And yet, until fairly recently, and I say fairly recently in the historical sense of the word, not last year or the year before, but it hasn't been considered, it hasn't been sort of a Christian thing, shall we say. In fact, for a large part of Nazareth's history, it has been a pure Arab Muslim town. With obviously the various places that are considered to be holy places. Access was allowed on and off depending on who was reading. But if you want to go back and find out, well, where did Nazareth start? What was it? I mean, it didn't just spring up. It's not mentioned much in the Old Testament. It is a couple of times, and I mentioned that last week. But it only really is mentioned in the New Testament. That's where we get our knowledge from. But if you go back to I don't know where it was. Oh yeah, here we go. About 300 A.D. in a ruins of a church in I forget where it was now. Oh, Caesarea. That's right. In the middle of a church in Caesarea, there's an inscription which chronicles the assignment of priests to Nazareth. You know, like Father so and so or whatever priest, not Father, it would be a Jewish priest, but this priest was responsible for the Nazareth, town of Nazareth. So it was around people living there certainly in AD 300, and this tablet, as I say, inscription, kind of ties back to that Bar Kokhba revolt of AD 132, you know, where the Jews revolted against the occupying powers and got beaten again. Okay, there's an 8th century Hebrew inscription, which is really the earliest known Hebrew reference. The other one was just an archaeological reference, but the earliest known Hebrew reference to Nazareth was about the only thing they had. In 331, Eusebius, the great writer, we hear I mention his name a lot, but if you want to check him out on the internet or Wikipedia or somewhere like that, Eusebius, we owe a lot to him because he wrote about everything, not just religious things. He wrote about all sorts of things. A great writer of his time. Cicero did the same for the Romans, I think, at a different time and place, but they record things that give us things to hang back on. For example, Eusebius in 331, okay, 331 AD, of course. Okay, so let's second century church, records that Christ was called a Nazarene. Okay, well, we know that from the Bible. And that in earlier centuries, okay, AD 100, AD 200, Christians were once called Nazarenes. Now that happens if you read your Bible. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the Paul, I think, even talks about Nazarenes and Christians. I think it's Paul. But anyway, Tertullian, again, the Roman writer, records that for this reason, and he was a Christian, the Jews call us Nazarenes. Okay, so in other words, they're basing not on the name of Jesus, but his name is Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, which is how people were named then. You either named Jesus bin Joseph, which is son of Joseph, and then it would be bin Joseph al Nazareth, which was the town. So it's quite common, even today, people who follow a particular cult or sports group or something like that are not called after the names of the team, but after where the team comes from. Like Spurs or Arsenal or something like that. They're English ones, by the way. Okay, in the New Testament, Christians are called Christians 3 times by Paul in Romans, although he does refer to them as Nazarenes somewhere else. And Nazarenes once by Tertullius, who was a Jewish lawyer. Not Tertullian, Tertullius, who was a Jewish lawyer. So, and what's interesting, and I found this very interesting, is that the rabbinic, in other words, the official rabbinical rule, if you will, which governs Judaism, and the modern Hebrew name for Christians is Notzrim. Notzrim is also thought to derive from the word from Nazareth. So whatever the town may have been, the name of it has obviously stayed with us for a long time. And in fact, if you remember, it was Tertullus, the Jewish lawyer, whose charge against Paul was that he was a member of the sect of the Nazarenes. So to the Jewish ruling priestly class or whatever was in what was left of Jerusalem and that's what afterwards, or before the destruction of Jerusalem, they didn't call them Jesus followers, they didn't call them Christians initially, they were called Nazarenes, and they were considered to be a sect. Just like today when some person starts off a church over here and calls themselves the Church of the Holy whatever, and starts promoting a different form of belief to the one that we are normally, subscribe to, tend to be addressed as sects, Oh, that's that wacko sects that worship snakes or flip-flops or something, I don't know. Anyway, okay. And in Acts, Nazorui, men of Nazareth in Acts, some Jewish medieval texts, 1300s, connect Notzrim with Netzarim, which is the watchman of Ephraim. Do you remember in Jeremiah 31, he talks about the watchman of Ephraim looking out for what's coming, and so that we go back to what I was saying in the first program, that this Nazareth, Notzri, whatever, seems to tie in with watchman, and it has all sorts of interesting connotations. It's not important that you know all this as part of your Christian faith, but as part of learning some of the history and the stuff behind it, it is interesting. Otherwise, we wouldn't do the program anyway. But if you read Jeremiah 31:6, he talks about the watchman of Ephraim, which is the Notzrim. In India, now I didn't know this. I'm doing some research on this. In India, there's a community of Jewish Christians. Now, that has always been something of a mind-boggler to me because, I know there are Messianic Jews, and that's a thing we see today, but This is an ancient community of Jewish, obviously Jews, who recognized Christ as the Messiah and accepted him as such. That's right. But it's an ancient community that still exists today in India, which is the land of the Hindu and all the other things. It's amazing. I mean, Christianity exists in India, but it's by far outshadowed by the other Buddhism and Hinduism and things like that. But they're called the St. Thomas Christians. That's their name. And why? Well, they trace their origins, to the evangelistic activity of Thomas the Apostle in the first century church. Thomas went to India. There's a couple of references to him in the Bible, but he went to India. But they're known today, these St. Thomas Christians, their kind of group name is Nazarenes, even today, from Nazareth. I mean, and that's ancient. I mean, that's 2,000 years old, over that, okay? Okay, so Nazareth obviously has been around for a while. In the New Testament, obviously, the name gets picked up by the people who are opposed to Jesus, because I don't think the apostles ever called themselves Nazarenes. I couldn't find any reference in the Bible. I can't find any reference from scholarly treks on who said what. I think the apostles called themselves Jesus followers, as far as I can tell. Or when asked what they were followers of Jesus. You know, in fact, even the term Jesus Christ was not used a great deal in first, second century churches. That's a later addition to it. You know, I mean, okay, archaeological research. Now, here's the big thing I love about studying the Bible and things around it and this sort of thing is that every time somebody says, well, I don't think that even existed, somebody digs a hole somewhere. And lo and behold, up comes a rock that says it is too. You know, I mean, at a site called Kfar HaHorish, about 2 miles from the current position of Nazareth. So that's, you know, that's close, okay? It dates back roughly to 9,000 years. That's the pre-pottery Neolithic. I mean, that's old, ancient. That's way before the Stone Age. I mean, it's so somebody was living there. I mean, Israel's not a country that just, or the whole Palestine isn't a country that just, when the Jews marched into it, they were the only people there. I mean, it had been going quite a while. And they found, literally, this is what's interesting here, I found this, they found the remains of about 65 individual people buried under huge horizontal headstones. That's always a bit, when people start marking graves with headstones, that's a big sign of I would say civilization, but a big sign of certainly some sort of cohesive family or tribal element, okay? Some of which consisted of about 3 tons of weight of white plaster, you know, which were covered these stones and bodies. So that's a lot of effort put into some sort of burial rite. Has no real bearing on modern Nazareth, but it does in fact give us an idea that people were using the site. And I think because of, if you look at the pictures that come up behind me sometimes, one of them shows an old picture of Nazareth with Mount Tabor in the background, and that Mount Tabor, I think, has been a significant point of attraction or worship, whatever you want to call it. Okay, but anyway, because of that, archaeologists have said that area was part of a major cult center in that area, and they've done some extensive excavations there in the last, I think, last couple of decades. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and they've uncovered pottery from the Middle Bronze Age, which is 2,000 to 3,500 BC, ceramics, grinding mills from the Iron Age, which you know, what it indicates is that it's continuously been lived in as a fairly substantial settlement for in that Nazareth basin for a long time. But lack of archaeological evidence, there's one thing to consider. It's all very well to start digging around and say, okay, this site was settled in 9,000 and then 5,000 and 4,000, 3,000, no, continuously settled. But there's a lack of evidence about Nazareth or the area around it from the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Persian, the Hellenistic, or even the early Roman times. And it looks like the settlement came to an abrupt end in about 720 BC. And that's probably because the Assyrians destroyed many of the towns in the area. I mean, if an invading army comes in, back then anyway, and attacks the town, first of all they knock the walls down if you've got any, right? And then what they do is demolish houses, because if you've got nowhere to live, you're going to move. And then they usually fill the wells in, or, you know, drop stones in so you can't use it, that sort of thing. So in other words, they make the place uninhabitable, so people move off. And since Nazareth is so far up in the Galilean area, they probably moved off into other areas, and the place was desolate. Okay? According to the Gospel of Luke, Nazareth was the home village of Mary, which means that sometime between 720 BC and before BC, Mary was what, 14 or 15? So, you know, sometime around 15 BC, okay, Nazareth had to be populated again. So presumably in that period, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that anyone can find archaeological for that period of time. It would be nice to know, you know, when did Mary's family move to Nazareth? When did they, you know, what brought them there? Did they come, you know, because it's not a terribly fertile place, so what brought them there, you know? It's interesting that, excuse me, it's interesting that, and I'm digressing a little bit here, but most of you know that whilst Joseph was always considered to be a carpenter, and that's where Jesus learned his trade as a carpenter, in fact, Joseph more likely worked more in stone than in wood. I mean, I don't want to shatter anyone's illusions, but there's a lot more stone in Palestine than there is wood. I mean, back then anyway. There's a little more now because they've forested the area and that sort of thing. But you know, if olive trees were the main wood, if you will, I mean, they didn't have cedars like Lebanon or things like that. And a lot of the utensils, one of the things that I always get amused of when I read stories about the search for the Holy Grail, or, you know, or the Raiders of the Lost, whatever it is, you know, and they all show, you know, beaten copper or beaten glass or beaten glass, gold and this sort of thing. But in fact, most of the drinking vessels of that time, for the regular people, not the Roman conquerors who had, you know, goblets made out of metal and that, but most of it was stone, sandstone, soapstone, easily worked. And we find that, I mean, when they've dug up areas in Israel around the period of Christ, what they find is a lot of stone vases and goblets and bowls and this sort of thing. Why? Because, well, first of all, the wood rots away if there was wood, and wood was expensive. And you know, if you're, you know, people didn't have a hutch in the corner with you know, dinner table service on, everything like that, obviously, you know. So, I mean, you see the oil lamps. Nearly all the oil lamps you see are made of stone. So Joseph probably was more of a stone cutter and did, if you like, did woodwork on the side, you know. But maybe they were building Nazareth up at some point. Maybe the town had started to build up, and perhaps Joseph moved to Nazareth because of his trade. I mean, he's certainly older than Mary, and there's always this up and down of how old Joseph was. But don't forget, old in those days, 35 was old. You know, I mean, ancient was 50. So what I would be, I don't know, Methuselah probably. But you see my point. If Joseph moved there to ply his trade, which obviously he did because the Bible refers to him as doing his trade, then maybe that's what it is. Anyway, Nazareth was the home village of Mary, so she was born there. And what's interesting, to me anyway, and I suppose everyone's blinded by the wonder of Christ and that sort of thing, but nobody says anything about, so who is this Mary? And what are her parents like? Have you ever seen a film, a biblical film, be it a Cecil B. DeMille version or Trinity Broadcasting version? Have you ever seen a film that shows Mary with her parents? And we know she had them, obviously, but you never hear about them. You never hear. I mean, it's interesting to think, what did Mary's parents say when she walked in and said, you know that guy I'm going to marry, Joseph? Well, I'm pregnant. I mean, it doesn't matter what era you live in. Parents are parents, are they not? And can you imagine the reception Mary got when, after the Annunciation and that sort of thing, which we're going to talk about, but she goes home because she's living with her parents. She's a single woman. She's not living on her own. She hasn't got an apartment downtown in a sports car. She's living on her own with her parents. And she goes home and says, I've got some great news for you. I'm going to carry the Son of God. I can just imagine her father going, right, And it says a lot about Joseph. I mean, Joseph's one of the most misunderstood or misrepresented people, I think, in the whole of this Jesus birth thing. Joseph was apparently a devout Jew, following the law and this sort of thing. And it's not that he had the right to tell Mary to get lost, right? According to the law, he had the duty to tell her to get lost. It was his duty to say, hey, out you go. Everything's null and void. And for him to say, no, it's okay, we'll take care of it, And of course he got the visit as well, the dream or whatever you want to call it. So that helped him with his decision. But it was a major, major decision. And what's really interesting is that after that decision's made, after the trip to Bethlehem, I'm jumping ahead here, but we'll get back to the story in a minute. And after that trip to Bethlehem, they come back to Nazareth. And Jesus grows up there. Can you imagine growing up with all the neighborhood kids saying, yeah, we know the story about you, how Joseph had to marry your mother, keep her decent, I mean, kids are kids, but don't care what era you live in. And if you break the Jewish law, unfortunately, it's very unforgiving. And back then, that's all there was. So it's an interesting thing. Anyway, I completely digress, but it's been on my mind. Anyway, Nazareth was a site of the Annunciation when Gabriel informs Mary that she would give birth to Jesus. And then, according to the Gospel of Matthew, as I just said, Mary and Joseph resettled in Nazareth after returning from the flight from Bethlehem to Egypt. Now, there's a contradiction here in the Bible. Oh my goodness, there's a contradiction in the Bible. Okay, because in one part you read that they went from Bethlehem to Egypt, and another part you read they went from Nazareth to Egypt. And to me it's logical that whilst in Bethlehem, and as we know, the wise men didn't arrive until, some people say, as long as 2 years afterwards. Obviously Mary couldn't travel for quite a while till the child was stronger, and maybe Joseph found work in Bethlehem. I mean, nobody knew him in Bethlehem, at least, not as far as we can tell. So he could have worked there and there were no snide remarks or aspersions about his wife and his child. Okay, so maybe he stayed there. But anyway, it's reckoned by most scholars that 18 months or so was before the wise men arrived, which of course was why Herod started at 2 years down with the innocents. I mean, if he was just looking for a newborn babe, he could say anything below 6 weeks, get rid of it. But no, he said 2 years. So obviously there's this great time difference, which puzzles some people sometimes, but until they start looking at it. Anyway, but the contradictions or the differences in the Bible between the two accounts It's part of the problem with synoptic gospels, you know, where synoptic means that they're like the same but different. You know, according to the Bible, Jesus grew up in Nazareth from some point in his childhood. All right? But what point? Did they go from Bethlehem to Egypt, to the Jewish congregation there in Alexandria? Or did they go back to Nazareth and then heard the news that, because there again, Herod didn't say anything about killing the young children in Nazareth. He was talking about down close to Jerusalem. So there's a difference. And so what we'll do as homework this week is you guys will read your Bible and the two different accounts and form your own opinions. And when I come back next week, we'll discuss it, all right? But personally, I think that they went from Bethlehem to Egypt. It makes much more sense. But we'll see. Until then, as I say, study hard your Bible, and I'll see you next week. Good night. God bless.